All right, welcome back to our third week lecture, part 2 on the age of imperialism. I'm going to again be keeping the Google Slides in the same format as yesterday, just because it's a little bit easier for me to record utilizing this format. Today's topic is going to be the age of imperialism, which is going to be the last component of items that will be on the Unit 1 test for History 122. So we're going to begin by talking about the concept of new imperialism. And it's important for us to place ourselves in the time period and think about the fact that during the Age of Reconstruction, America is largely focused on its domestic issues. And so, therefore, they're really not worried much about the international scope of things, although some Northeast bankers and industrialists are pursuing international outreach in the realms of trade and banking. But as industrialism spreads and Reconstruction ends, the world becomes ripe for America once again, and we truly begin to envision ourselves as players on the international stage. Now, in this realm, we're a little bit far behind. Most of our expansion up to this point has been on the continent of North America. I should say all of our expansion up to this point has been on the continent of North America. And just to recap some of the earlier pursuits that we've discussed, you can see here how the United States has spread out territorially during this time period, and some of the ways that we have expanded the United States are shown here on this map. One of the most notable in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, of course, would be what was initially deemed Seward's Folly, which was the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Many people ridiculed Secretary of State William Seward for this purchase. They called it Seward's icebox. And then, of course, that would drastically change once oil is discovered in Alaska and it becomes an incredibly profitable portion of the United States. As we begin to also wind down from Reconstruction, we turn our attentions as well to Hawaii. Hawaii was an area that initially kind of came into the scope of the United States's dealings, you could say, in 1875, when a trade agreement with the Hawaiians led to a rise in American sugar plantations based in Hawaii. Many of these sugar plantations imported labor from Asia. And by the 1890s, that importation of labor upset the balance of population in Hawaii so much that only 1/6 of the people in Hawaii in the 1890s were Native Hawaiians. There was a rapid influx of labor, and with that, a rapid influx of smallpox, which really was detrimental to the Native Hawaiian population. In 1885, Grover Cleveland officially called Hawaii a stepping stone to the Pacific, and in 1887 ratified a treaty with the Hawaiian monarchy to place a naval base there. And I'm sure all of you know the name of that naval base, Pearl Harbor. In 1890, the McKinley Tariff impacted the favored sugar position and created an economic crisis for the American plantation owners there. And then simultaneously, Queen Liliuokalani began her ascent to the throne, being sworn in 1891. And she was not deemed to be as powerful by the Hawaiian planters, and in 1893 they decided to attempt to overthrow her and simultaneously petition for annexation by the United States government. Grover Cleveland actually deemed this improper. However, the planters refused to step down and created the Republic of Hawaii. And then when Grover Cleveland leaves office and McKinley comes in, McKinley really works hard to officially annex Hawaii and does so in the summer of 1898. And in 1900, we officially deem Hawaii to be a territory of the United States. And so this is one way in which we expand our country in the lead up to our stepping point onto the international stage. Now, while this is going on, it's important for us to consider the mindset of individuals who were making decisions about the United States and how it was going to pursue its international adventures, one could say. And of course, the president is always the chief individual orchestrating all of this. And although we haven't quite gotten into the topic of the Philippines yet, I do want to share William McKinley's quote on the Philippines. And I want you to just read it for a moment and see what you think are the 4 reasons McKinley includes for his pursuit of imperialism in this venture with the Philippines. So McKinley says, and one night late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. So here McKinley is kind of alluding to the fact that, you know, we have to keep this territory because we want to have a reputation. We want to save face. We're not going to turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. So there's economic motivations for pursuing imperialism. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and that they would have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. This idea of spreading democracy. And there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. And then in this last segment, this white man's burden, that we are superior to the Filipinos and that we are obligated to bring them up and Christianize them, this religious and moral motivation that many cite for imperialism. By the way, one thing we didn't touch on very deeply yet is exactly what imperialism is. I imagine by now most of you know, but it's essentially one country's unwilling occupation of another, usually for economic reasons. But as we can see here, men like McKinley had other rationale behind pursuing imperialism. So the real stepping stone for America into the world stage in regards to imperialism takes place with the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War is, you know, an event that doesn't occur in a vacuum. It happens initially after some back and forth with Spain that does not go as planned, at least as far as the United States is concerned. I have a set of primary source documents that I will share with you if you're interested in viewing them further. But it's really twofold. We're outraged by Spain's treatment of Cuba, and then also simultaneously fearful of Spain's proximity to the United States with their occupation of Cuba, which essentially is in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. We do a lot of trade with Cuba, actually more trade than Spain does, both through mining ventures and sugar, and they're also a major export market for us. And the Spanish are absolutely treating the Cubans quite poorly. You can see here, Senator Proctor took a visit to Cuba in the late 1890s, and these are images that he depicted of what he saw there. There was a General Valeriano, they called him Valeriano Weyler. They called him Butcher Weyler because he opened reconcentrado camps or reconcentration camps which in many ways were just as horrific as what the Nazis would do to the Jews and other undesirables during the Second World War. And so that was one reason why we advocated for stepping in. We also received a letter written by Spanish Ambassador Dupuy de Leon that was stolen by a Cuban spy and given to the United States, calling McKinley a coward for not stepping in Cuba. And then the real icing on the cake occurs on February 15th, 1898, when a USS warship, U.S. warship, the USS Maine, blows up anchored in the harbor of Havana. And as you can see here by the headline in the New York Journal, which was similar to the headline in the New York Post, that they are ultimately blaming the destruction of the Maine on the Spanish, claiming it was a Spanish mine. Years later, it was actually released that it was improperly stored munitions. But during this time period, the practice of yellow journalism, twisting the news to get a reaction, I'm sure you guys could never imagine that happening in this day and time, but twisting the news to get a reaction is really coming of age. And McKinley allegedly said to the editor of the New York Journal and the New York Post, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." And although in the follow-up to the sinking of the Maine, there are actually negotiations between the Spanish and the United States to remove Spain's influence in Cuba, McKinley's really backed up against a wall in the public realm. And so on April 11th, 1898, McKinley asks Congress to use arms in Cuba, and a war declaration is following on April 20th. And within 10 days, Admiral Dewey also takes his ships to Manila Bay in the Philippines, where the Spanish Navy is also docked. And so they're going to try and fight a two-front war. Here, the just absolute rapid advance. There is a typo here on June 22nd. We have the Rough Riders actually arriving in Cuba, but they had presence as well in Puerto Rico. And we have fighting erupting throughout Cuba in July, and then a very quick armistice reached by August. And so they call this the Splendid Little War. It lasts less than 100 days. And then actually the day after the armistice is reached, Dewey goes into the Philippines and destroys the Spanish Armada, despite the fact that the war is officially over. The aftermath of the war will catapult us onto the realm of being an imperialist nation, even further than the acquisition of Hawaii does. We, in the Treaty of Paris, another Treaty of Paris that is signed in December of 1898, Cuba is declared independent. The Philippines are, at that point in time, unresolved, but part of a $20 million package that the United States gets the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam from Spain. It's a rather unpopular treaty because many Americans are fearful that we will do the same to the Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and residents of Guam that the Spanish had been doing. Our relationship with Cuba also becomes rather contentious. In 1901, we passed the Platt Amendment, which restricts Cuba even further than the Teller Amendment had with the outbreak of the war. And it also allows us to get involved heavily in Cuban affairs, which is going to set us up for bad relations that will affect us tremendously in the 1960s. In 1934, we loosen the restrictions somewhat, but we continue a presence there in Guantanamo Bay, where today we still have a military base, as many of you know. In Puerto Rico, we still technically have Puerto Rico as a United States territory. In 1917, the Jones Act was passed, which made Puerto Ricans citizens of the United States. And in 1952, they were officially declared a Commonwealth. We did not take the same approach with the Philippines, but instead had lots of issues there, including armed conflict for 3 years between 1899 and 1902. And 100,000 Filipinos died, over 4,000 American soldiers died. And for a period of time, we had a military government over Puerto Rico, over the Philippines. And then in 1902, we made them an unorganized territory. As part of the Jones Act, we said they would be independent someday. We left it pretty wide open. And then in 1934, we said, oh, only 10 more years. But then, of course, the war, Second World War breaks out. So it's not going to be until July 4th, 1946, that the Filipinos actually gain their independence. But during this time period, many Filipinos emigrated to the United States. And there are actually more Filipino immigrants here in the U.S. than any other Asian country. And there is still a pretty strong American presence in the Philippines. Also, during this time period, we are operating in the Asian realm. And this particular area of the world is going to be one that will be pursued largely for trade purposes. And within that, the trade purpose is with China in what we call the open door policy. The open door policy was negotiated by Secretary of State John Hay. And John Hay was worried that the United States was not going to have a large trading presence in China. And so he advocated for something called the open door policy, which would allow for unrestricted trade from all foreign nations, and basically said that everybody would have equal favor in China. Only the British actually officially accept it. Nobody else really has a reaction to Hayes's 1899 policy, but in 1900, the foreign influence actually results in something known as the Boxer Rebellion in China, because the Chinese are incredibly annoyed at the foreign presence, and this is also going to set up some contentious issues at this time. No conversation about imperialism, though, would be complete without a discussion of the role of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was born in 1858 and grew up in Manhattan. He was a rather weak child who worked very hard to pursue personal strength as well as education. And as was said of him, you could practically wring out the personality. He was that vivacious. He was Harvard educated and became a part of the New York State Legislature in 1884. But then that same year on Valentine's Day, he lost his wife in childbirth when his daughter was born, and his mother 12 hours later. And he takes off to pursue life in the West as a cowboy for 2 years. Before returning as he's civil service commissioner in New York City, and then the New York City Police Commissioner before becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Spanish-American War. And he also, for a period of time, was the governor of New York. And in 1900, when McKinley ran for re-election, he asked Roosevelt to be his vice president, not knowing that upon re-election, when McKinley would be assassinated on September 6, 1901, by an anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz, Teddy Roosevelt would become president. And he was the youngest person to ever ascend into the office of the president, 6 weeks short of his 43rd birthday, and really our first truly activist president. And this political cartoon here shows Roosevelt's mentality of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, which is going to get us far, he says. One of the main areas where Roosevelt turns his interests is to Panama. At this point in history, the French had been attempting to build a canal there, but they were doing a terrible job. They were $300 million in debt and had over 20,000 workers dead and had not even progressed a third of the way across the canal. Colombia owned Panama at that point in time. And after initially trying to negotiate with Colombia, Roosevelt sends in his Secretary of State to negotiate with the Panamanians and encourage them to revolt with our support to throw Colombia out. And in exchange for our support, we would get in perpetuity the use, occupation, and control of the canal zone. We finished the canal just before World War I, and at a cost of $400 million. It was actually ahead of schedule and under budget, a first for an American construction project, and it probably hasn't happened since. So before we close out today's lecture, I just want to share with you this political cartoon. It shows the growth of America from our start with the initial Treaty of Paris that impacted us at the end of the Revolutionary War, up to our successes in the Spanish-American War. And these successes would continue into the 20th century. In 1904, Roosevelt issues his own corollary to the to the Monroe Doctrine, saying that we would intervene first in any conflicts in Latin America. Unfortunately, our numerous interventions, which we'll talk more about in the next unit, would lead to our image as a so-called bad neighbor. But Roosevelt is continuously attempting to show off our military prowess and get involved periodically in other in areas of both North America and Latin America during his presidency. The lasting impacts of this age of imperialism are that America is now a player on the world stage, and soon the world will be heating up for its first world war, which we'll tackle next week. We also are witnessing colonial land grabs around the world, which are going to fuel future conflicts. Sadly, our interventions in Latin America are going to create our bad neighbor image. And as we're going to see as we explore history, the age of imperialism has other consequences that are going to last until today. So tomorrow at the beginning of class, we are going to take a look at the Socratives, so no need to do that now. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And tomorrow we'll also tackle questions for the test that you will be taking during spring break. So thanks for watching. Have a good afternoon.